And the last piece is their liquidity. Now, what makes camels problematic is that if you actually are kind of focused on a camel, it's a wonderful metaphor, by the way, what you kind of care about is that mysterious ability to go for a long time without drinking. So let's work our camel metaphor into the market conversation for a second. We are now going to invoke many of the points that were on these sheets. The camel, now our camel, our metaphorical financial camel, is about to cross a desert. Now I'll get to how long the desert is and how hot it is. We'll get to that part. But our camel's about to cross the desert, and the thing we care about our camel is the quality of the liquidity, because that's kind of important. Well, here's the tiny problem. The estimate is there's $54 billion of liquidity in the camel. If you actually look at what's actually happened in explicit collapses, FDIC overseen transfers of assets, we are close to tapping out our camel before we've gotten to the desert. Close. There is a lack of transparency in precisely how close we are, but if you look at the numbers on balance sheet deposit exposures, the camel is actually starting relatively thirsty. But never fear, because what we've decided is a gravitational constant since the Bretton Woods conference is that we can make more money. We can make more money, very conveniently, because there's always, and I'm quoting now, 2 past Fed chairmen, and I'm quoting every economic advisor to this administration and the 2 current candidates to take over the administration, there's always foreign investors who will buy our debt. Kind of like the FDIC's recent report that says it models itself on looking at quality investment institutions like Merrill Lynch. That's a quote from the Inspector General's audit of August of 2008. You heard me correctly. That's a quote, August 2008. That's the level of integrity we're working with here. But that's okay. They know what they're doing. The rest of us are mere plebes in the system. We don't know what we're talking about. We can always sell our debt to somebody. Now, somebody asked the interesting question about kind of where we stand with we keep printing these ridiculous numbers like billions. We got 10 billion a month for this. We've got 700 billion being debated. We've got billions here and billions there and billions somewhere else. And then if you actually look at what's supporting that, which is this beautiful, elaborate series of securitizations, we enter into the trillions conversation. And then I love this. If you go up to ICAP, which I mentioned in the last SpringSide chat, which is the place where you have the electronic trading floor for credit default swaps and derivatives, you actually get into, are you ready for this, quadrillions. Now, at a certain level of scientific notation, we're talking about real money. I don't know where it is, but somewhere in the post-billion for me, you start getting my attention. And certainly when you're in quadrillions, you've got my attention. Quadrillions of credit default swaps and derivative products. As I said in our last update from the Arlington Institute, we're talking about a situation where ICAP alone trades $1.3 trillion of derivatives a day. $1.3 trillion of derivatives a day.
Excuse me, I've read your paper, and ICAP, what is it?
ICAP is the electronic trading floor based right across the river, right across the Hudson River up in New York. It is an electronic trading desk, which if you actually ever go on the stock exchange floor, it's actually where the offsetting counterparty risks are placed on a host of investment vehicles. What the public has been told about ICAP is that you need to have this fair exchange where financial institutions can go in and swap these things out. Now, those of you who want me to comment on the Goldman Sachs AIG conflict of interest, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to point you in the direction of look into it. It's interesting. And look into particularly Secretary Paulson's interest in that. It's interesting. We're not going to cover that. But what I will say is that the interesting piece of the ICAP story, which people aren't paying attention to, is that the collateralized mortgage obligations for credit default swaps represented a fractional percent of actually what was being bankrolled on derivative swaps. What actually represents a far higher level of value is something which politically is far more unpalatable to discuss. But that's why I'm discussing it. And if Obama or if McCain were in the room, I would actually challenge them to actually have the fortitude to stand up in front of the American people and actually tell them what the real problem is. Because it's not mortgages. And by the way, the piece I wrote that you have, which actually deals with the consumer credit problem, which is in fact what we're calling a mortgage problem. The mortgages were merely second liens against home equity. We don't have a housing bubble. We never had a housing bubble. There never was a housing bubble. What we had was a consumer credit refi bubble where what we called a piece of collateral, real estate, was used to prop up a way to shove cash into consumers' pockets. It's a second mortgage crisis, not a primary crisis, not a real estate crisis, and you can't solve the problem by establishing a floor value on real estate. So every bit of the $700 billion proposal, which thankfully didn't get passed, and every bit about the one that they're trying to pass, is unfortunately still not addressing the issue. You don't solve a real estate problem because that's not the problem. The problem is a consumer-based collateral use of a real estate property on second and tertiary mortgages to pay off credit cards. That's it. You wipe the consumer spending bubble out of the economy, you don't have a $700 billion crisis. But you do have a crisis. Okay, let's get something straight. You do have a crisis. The crisis is called an inversion of the credit or equity to debt ratio of American consumers. Somewhere along the line, in the 70s, we smoked too much, had free sex too much, we did something too much, we don't know what it is, but something happened, and we short-circuited our brains enough to say that we can spend money we don't have. Now, I think that we had a pharmacologically enhanced awareness that allowed us to enter into this wonderful space of saying, everybody around the world will always buy our debt. That, by the way, came out in the 1970s, 1973 to be precise. 1973 is when we created the current crisis. That's when we made it a fiat that said the foreign interests will buy our debt. That's good. We accepted that, and we've never questioned it. They will buy our debt. So we march forward. We march forward. And then we, collectively, start saying that it really is about our consumption. Bear in mind that every negotiation of the World Trade Organization in every country started off with a definition of countries as, are we ready for this? Developed, developing, least developed. Guess who got to figure out who's in the developed countries? The people whose debt was being sold. Guess who got to be in the developing countries? The people who are getting credit extended to be complicit with the developing thing. And guess what the least developed countries were? Well, the least developed countries were the ones that couldn't play in the racket yet. The 63 countries that couldn't play in the racket were least developed. Then there was a slug of about 100 countries that actually were basically on their developing pathway, which meant that they would be complicit in financial systems. And then there were the 10 at the top that were the most developed. There's an interesting question that was asked about where's China and where's Russia? This is where it becomes relevant, because the assumptions were that China and Russia would stay very appropriately in that middle slice. That middle slice of developing. That was an interesting mathematics argument. The mathematics argument was China has 1 billion people. They can't get them out of poverty. They're basically an 83% agriculture economy. There's no way you're going to get China to be part of the system. What we failed to realize is that the Chinese have been around for a really long time. They've been around for a long time, and for them, we're the anomaly. we are the anomaly. We are a giant 200-year-old market test. They're watching. They're participating. So there is a tiny bit of a problem because there is the Pygmalion in the classroom, for those of you in social sciences. There is the Pygmalion in the classroom effect. They've manipulated the test. They manipulated the test by actually buying our treasuries. And they got us to a point where they actually were able to reinforce the myth that if you actually go to a treasury auction, somebody from China will buy whatever we offer. There's a reason for that. China was trying to build its domestic production capacity. Why? Because they really wanted to export plastic tickle-me-elmos to the United States, right? That's what they really wanted. No. They wanted to build an infrastructure. To build an infrastructure, you need to find a consumer. Turns out that if you can actually find a consumer who's willing to do this, which is a really great deal, they're willing to buy from you, and they're willing to sell leverage that they'll use later from you, it's a wonderful closed-loop system. Because China decided it would actually use the U.S. economy to fuel, because we were the consumers, to fuel its production, so it built its manufacturing capabilities, which it did, and which now can, at a flash, turn off all flows to us and go to domestic production for domestic consumption. Where's China in all this? My forecast that I made last time is still the forecast I'm making right now. The fourth quarter is when China finally says, thank you very much. You've given us a 25-year, wonderful municipal bond to build all of our infrastructure, to build all of our systems, to build all of our cities. And by the way, we actually have 10,000 guys in boxes beating drums and banging things up and everything else, and you just got to see them on TV, and you paid to see that. Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful? We got to see the final punctuation in the long sentence that started in 1973 that said, we will sell our future, and the Chinese will actually buy it. Well, they did. The Chinese bought our future. Now, let's go back to the currency for a second, because it's important to weave these stories together, like the tapestry on the wall behind us. What happens when the Dukas force figures out that about 1 to 2% of our overall currency is all you need to counterfeit before you actually permanently destabilize a currency? About 2%. It's actually 1 point something. What if you found out that the Chinese effectively control somewhere close to 32% of our currency today? 32%. And did anybody pay attention to where, we've got a couple bankers in the room, where's the largest production of actual counterfeit currency happening right now? Does anybody know? Macau. Macau. The reason why we actually have to change our bills so frequently, this is actually why we have to change our bills so frequently, is because the counterfeiters in Macau have done such a wonderful job of changing their printing systems and their copying systems that they are actually preempting our plates before we print the new currency. There's a beautiful thing that you can look at, and you can find these online, actually, some really beautiful issues. And as you know, the Secret Service is the one who monitors this. I'd encourage you, if you want to look at what the Secret Service is doing with currency coming out of Macau, particularly $100 bills. They're actually blowing them up. They're taking a photograph, high-resolution digital photograph. They're blowing them up the size of this floor area right here, because it takes that high of an enhancement of the visual elements of a counterfeit $100 bill out of Macau to actually figure out that it's actually counterfeit. They have to do it on every bill. They have to actually make it floor size, carpet size, to inspect the quality of the counterfeit. And there's some wonderful pictures of Secret Service guys leaning over floor-sized $100 bills with magnifying glasses looking to see if they can detect the difference between a counterfeit and a real. Now, the funny thing is, we've got a double-edged sword in China. Number one, we have the counterfeiters of our currency, literally the counterfeiters of our currency there. Second, we have our treasury there. We've actually given China carte blanche control of our economy. And that was, by the way, before the crisis. That was before the crisis. I don't